Okay, with our last session, and Peter Murphy, who's Associate Professor of Communications at Monash, though, more importantly, at this instance, Professor-elect of Creative Arts and Social Studies at James Cook University.
Correct.
Will give us the final paper, and I'm sure that time will be kept, and we'll have time to discuss your paper and do some sort of general roundup towards the end. Peter will read a paper entitled The Wars of Thankfulness.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. I need not say any more. The paper is a short paper. It has, however, a continuous subtext which you may pay attention to or you may ignore. And then there's perhaps one image in the continuous subtext that I will actually get people to pay attention to. Yes, the wars of metaphors. We would all go mad if we existed in a ceaseless state of imagining. Likewise, constant hilarity would leave us in a state of hysteria. A thin line separates imagination and delirium, wit and frenzy. Crossing that line is a treacherous matter. This is because the human being, the symbolic creature, needs to be adventurous, and yet it must also husband its capacities. It relies on both wit and reason. Wit permits human beings to both see something as itself and as something else at the same time. A double register lies at the core of the imagination. And this is Andrew's being another. Figuratively speaking, we look at something. We see more than one thing in the single thing that we look at. We then bridge between bifocal things, and in doing so we discover what it is that they have in common. In that lies the act of creation. Having created the bridge and discovered the unlikely resemblance between radically disparate objects, between being and other, having leapt from the thought of one thing to the thought of another thing entirely, and having fused those leaping thoughts into a single, placid, enigmatic image, and having thereby exhausted ourselves in the act of mental gymnastics, we acrobats stop and reason. The imagination is not irrational, it is ironical. This is what separates intellect from reason. Intellect is paradoxical. It equates X and Y, X and not X. It thereby gives us the premises upon which we reason. It furnishes us with the ends of existence for which we then have to find the means. Such ends and such premises are posited by the imagination. Reason, in the sense of rationality, is the unfolding or working through of the logical inference of those ends and grounds. Imagination allows human beings to make the leap from the observation of the bird to the thought of mechanical winged flight. The imagination is a faculty that compounds bird and machine. Reason is the royal road of inference that leads us from imaginative intuition to practical artefact. It is a long and winding road, in part because along that road further analogies always suggest themselves. The thrust of the jet engine is analogous to the thrust of the bird's tail feathers, and so on. While we readily distinguish between reason and imagination, like most distinctions and oppositions, what on first sight appears to be separate on reflection exhibits clear similarities in nature. It does not stretch things too far to say that the imagination has a rational core, while reason is the handmaiden of the imagination. The indissoluble link between reason and imagination is important to understand. Madness should not be confused with imagination. Ravings are neither reasonable nor are they imaginative. Likewise, prophecies and fantasies, no matter how unusual they may be, are not acts of imagination. The imagination is a practical faculty. It is not a font of unrealistic or impractical ideas. Many of the greatest artists, Shakespeare, Eliot and Stravinsky amongst them, were very astute in business matters. Similarly, the imagination is not the source of infernal, diabolical, extreme, wicked, cruel, hell-bent, heinous, nefarious or fiendish thoughts and deeds. I'm not saying that one cannot have a Gothic or abject imagination. The bird man is as much a product of human imagination as the bird machine is. The dreadful, the awful and the atrocious are as much the proper province of art as the picturesque, the pastoral or the polite are. But the source, the genesis of terrible acts is not the imagination. They arise rather from a lack of imagination. Cruelty and evil are a function of the imagination's failure, its faltering or its sheer absence. During the 1980s, the Argentine was convulsed in a dirty war. The ruling military dictatorship caused many of its opponents to disappear. Women were detained, raped, and their babies sold for profit. This monstrous conjunction of birth and violence had first to be conceived as a paramilitary policy before it was carried out in practice. How is such a thing to be understood? Was this not a conjunction of the imagination, in the same sense that the man bird or the mermaid creature is a projection of the mythical imagination? On the contrary, I think we have to distinguish between an act of imagination and a contrivance of evil. What imagination and evil superficially share in common is that they both defy expectation. That is why intellectuals who are easily charmed by the imagination are also easily charmed by evil. Hannah Arendt was correct. The mindset of dictatorship is banal, not imaginative. Tyrants defy expectations. They do so not by leaps of imagination, but rather by behaving with devastating arbitrariness. That is the basis of all terror. Even the most stupid person is capable of an act of infernal terror simply by violating any one of the basic moral norms that a child is supposed to learn. To do this, no intelligence whatsoever is required. Rather, those who are best equipped for wicked acts are those who are deficient in the faculty of sympathy. A lack of sympathy is another way of saying a lack of imagination. The imagination that allows us to see one thing as another also allows us to imagine our own self in the place of another person. I feel as you feel, I suffer as you suffer. This cannot be literally true, but we can, up to a point, feel, think or act as if we were someone else. Torturers and rapists, like the regimes that orchestrate torture and rape, cannot and do not do this. They lack the faculty of sympathy. When they concoct infernal systems like gulags or the sale of babies conceived in rape, what transpires is not the transcendental surprise of the imagination, but rather a shocking surprise that is born of a violentary, arbitrary will. The diabolical conjunction of impregnation and violence, the perverse bonding of birth and commerce, is born of a pathological desire to violate basic norms. This is sheer wickedness. It is not the imagination's elevated fusion of semantic nuclei, but the morbid will to the gutter, the will to transgress anything and all that is sacred, elemental and decent. Friends and relatives gather to celebrate the wedding of the young couple. The suicide bomber wreaks havoc. The peaceful scene is racked by devastating surprise. The surprise is shocking. The shock is dependent on the violation of an elementary norm. Imagination also surprises, perhaps shakes, and even on occasion shocks. But it does so without violating the basic norms of human intercourse. The imagination is not irrational, rather it is sceptical and ironical. The ironic intellect satirises norms, it lampoons practices. In doing this, though, a superior wit supports rather than subverts social order. It seeks out the transcendent thread in that order. It seeks to enrich and embellish and uphold it. In so doing, it mocks evildoers and ridicules stupid behaviours, and it does this in a particular way. Wit operates through the media of reversal. It communicates via transposition, inversion and transfiguration. The ironist says one thing and means the opposite, and sometimes teasingly means both things, though in acutely knowing and selected ways. At the same time, the ironist more often than not is provoked into action by the ironies of the world. Irony is an inversion of the world's own inversions and an attempt at reversing its perversions. I use the term perversion here in the same sense that Winston Churchill did when he upbraided the Nazis for their perverted science. Churchill always chose his words very carefully. The horror kitsch science of warped medical experiments represents exactly what the imagination is not. Even if at times the sinister dreams of tyrants are mistaken for the imagination, it is instructive to understand why the two nevertheless get to be confused. I am drawing here a firm distinction between the tainted dreams of tyrants and authentic acts of creation. Both conjugate. Both entail forms of condensation, but one yields ugly, crude, brutal works in which the underlying conjugation is invariably anchored in transgression. This is the dream come nightmare condensation of norm and crime, rule and dictate, virtue and terror, objectivation and arbitrary will. The perverse conjugation of crime and pseudo-creation has proved itself time and again to be seductive. Intellectuals especially love it. When they think of a norm, they always think of the exception. They idolise the exception as the norm. In their eyes, the rule is to violate the rule, and to rule is to break the rule. One can think of situations where such behaviour is appropriate. Yet why then are the dreams of intellectuals so often so shabby? One answer is that these dreams lack wit. In case you had not noticed, intellectuals frequently lack a sense of humour, especially humour that is directed at their own precious selves. This is a manifest deficit, not least because creation is a function of wit. In some circumstances, the best rule is to break the rule. Equally, the mirthless pursuit of trespass ends in the slave camps of North Korea. Not all intellectuals are drawn to the criminal conjugation, thankfully. One of the exceptions to the perverse rule of the exception was the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis. He spent most of his life in philosophy puzzling about the nature of the imagination. He was a shrewd observer of the many evils of the 20th century and the habitual seduction of intellectuals by tyrants. In response to both, Castoriadis suggested that the imagination is equally capable of the creation of immense horrors as it is of good and great works. That is a plausible idea. Yet, in the end, I think I disagree with it. When Stalin sent 14 million people to the Gulag labour camps, or forcibly deported millions of members of ethnic populations to new territories, or murdered the kulaks in order to collectivise agriculture, or withheld grain to create mass famines, were these acts of imagination or acts of tyranny? True, Stalin's rearranging of the face of a country and its peoples occurs on a sublime scale, and its methods are totalitarian. Yet its motive is still tyrannical. The tyrant does not imagine his own country as something that it is not, except insofar as it can be warped and twisted. The art of the dictator is not art at all, but a kind of anti-art, a horrible, demented kitsch in which society's tacit aesthetic form is buckled and bowed, collapsed and shrunken by real and symbolic violence. Let us suppose that the term uncanny does describe the human mind's propensity to see everything in another guise. It is possible then that the creepiness which all astute observers experience when they visit dictatorships and totalitarian states is a result of the encounter with the evil uncanny. I think, though, that in the end this misstates the nature of tyranny, no matter how vast are the ambitions of the tyrant. The sinister is not the dark equivalent of the uncanny. Tyrannies are much less interesting than that. The work of the Gulag Archipelago and the work of J.S. Bach are incommensurable. In the hands of Shakespeare, Richard III is a profound character. But what the dramaturgical figure of Richard III personifies is not the imagination, but rather the seductive nature of evil. Evil can be charming. Seduction and charm are not the same thing as the imagination. Richard III was not a poet laureate of the Plantagenet state. Neither was Stalin the Pushkin of his age, yet both were capable of charm of a particularly disturbing kind. The case for the proposition that tyrants have no great imagination can be made by examining the counter case of Winston Churchill. Without question, Churchill had a remarkable imagination. This was borne out in part by his prescience. Duly armed imagination allows us the occasional opportunity to see around corners in time, to see what is coming in the otherwise unknowable future. That said, social prophecy is mainly a waste of time. Donkeys make better predictions on average than most experts do. To predict the future on the basis of today's trends is futile, for time and history, as Shakespeare endlessly depicted, switch in the blink of an eye, just as the faculty of wit does. Both move with lightning speed, having not moved for a long time. To anticipate time's turning points requires an acrobatic mind, not the prophetic touch. Churchill illustrates this to a T. He was prescient because he was imaginative. In the 1890s, he observed that if not for modern technological science, Europe would fall to the onslaught of militant Islam. In one of his first parliamentary speeches in 1901, he foresaw the carnage of World War I more than a decade hence. As soon as that war ended, he warned of the evils of Bolshevism. In the early 1920s, Churchill foresaw the coming of the Second World War. In the early 1930s, almost alone, he warned of the hellish rise of Hitler. And in the middle of the Second World War, he was already anticipating what was to become the Cold War with the Soviet Union. His most controversial prognosis still haunts us. In the 1930s, Churchill opposed Britain granting India independence. Even his most ardent admirers wince at this today. Most people, though, forget that one of the primary reasons for his standing up like King Canute on the beach and opposing the tidal forward of nationalism impelling the independence of India was Churchill's prophecy that Hindus and Muslims would end up embroiled in deadly violence, a prediction that turned out to be absolutely correct. If Churchill was pugnaciously wrong, he was also puckishly correct. The independence of India from Britain led immediately to the partition of India and Pakistan, which caused in its wake the death of more than 1 million people. Subsequently, wars broke out between India and Pakistan in 1947, 1965, 1971 and 1999. Pakistani-inspired terrorism in India's Indian cities recurred through the 1990s and 2000s. Today, the single functional institution in Pakistan, the military, exists in and because of a perpetual state of paranoid expectation that an Indian invasion of Pakistan will happen at any moment in time. Thus it came to pass that even if the imperatives of modern nationalism made the independence of Imperial India inevitable, and who could today imagine anything else having happened, nevertheless Churchill's warnings about the consequences of independence proved to be no less true. It is not foresight alone, though, that characterises Churchill's imagination, even if his foresight far exceeded, as it indeed did, the historical scope of Stalin's not inconsiderable cunning. What makes the imagination imaginative is not the capacity to make the absent present, but rather the sin-antinomic act of taking one thing for its opposite. Please forgive this awkward elocution, but no word exists for what I want to say. In this case, we need a concept for a case where absence and presence are both separable and identical. Churchill's imagination was not a function of his foresight, extraordinary as that was, but rather that foresight, that uncanny peering into the future, was a function of the imagination's sin-antinomic structure. Churchill thought, composed and spoke habitually in antinomic pairs with a relish for reconciling them. Synantonymic thinking is a mirror of civilization. It is the mental interior of civilization's material exterior. Imagination is the ghost in the machinery of civilization. Civilization, conversely, is the apotheosis of the human double act. Everything in the human world has a latent, imaginary or symbolic dimension. Everything that we encounter is one and two at the same time, even if only tacitly or latently. This double nature, this uncanny or enigmatic character, is what makes all that is most interesting and most compelling in human existence. We can encapsulate all that is humanly interesting in one word: civilization. This includes friendship, justice, love, freedom, happiness, myth, religion, art, philosophy, technology and science. All that is fascinating in life has an uncanny double edge. I do not mean that everything that is fascinating or absorbing is ambiguous. Rather, more simply, what I mean is that great ideas and edifying practices arise as and when and because the human imagination is able to represent one thing as something else. Those ideas and practices arise firstly as intuitions, and then as artefacts and images, and finally and only belatedly as discourses. From the standpoint of linear time, this is a long historical process. It is an agonisingly slow one, punctuated with occasional startling breakthroughs, such as in Greek antiquity. The sum consequence of this process is civilization. The imagination is the natural ally of civilization. So it was with Churchill. Pugnacious and puckish, he was equally and eminently at home with caustic jokes and fine liquor, along with the ingenious technologies of modern industry and the delicate brushstrokes of the landscape painter. In comparison, Hitler set in train a sequence of monstrous deeds. Yet, Hitler did not have a monstrous imagination. This is only because he had little imagination at all. There is scant evidence in his case of even an abject or Gothic imagination. Look at Hitler's paintings. You can look at this one. Okay. They are stilted, inexpressive, postcard kitsch banalities. In contrast, Hitler's nemesis Churchill was a genuinely gifted amateur painter. This is not to suppose that world history is a contest of painterly technique. Rather, what it points to is that Churchill conceived the world in aesthetic terms. In his writings, he repeatedly evokes a faint deism and an explicit stoicism. He talked frequently, and did so in very subtle terms, about the liberty of spirit, the power of necessity, and the working of destiny in human lives. Each was interpolated in the other. He thought freedom unimaginable without laws, and the incessant profusion of modern laws the bane of a free society. For anyone who imagined this to be inconsistent, he warned against consistency in politics. He understood that politics was paradoxical and that history was ironical. He also knew instinctively that human beings reconcile the irreconcilable aesthetically. The world that the human being inhabits has aesthetic shape. To bend, buckle, twist, deform and warp it is the act of a tyrant. For the most part, Churchill was irreligious in outlook, and yet he had a theologico-politics that seems to me to have been at least as deeply thought out as that of Spinoza. He knew that human beings only reach the exalted state of liberty and freedom through the dint of dogged necessity and arduous destiny. All of this, though, was subsumed and reconciled in a transcendental aesthetic, an aesthetic politics of scale, magnitude, light and colour. An overarching philosophy of vista and proportion, light and colour, provided Churchill with a painterly vision of the ends of politics. Of the many promises he made as wartime Prime Minister to the British people and to all the peoples who sacrificed in World War II, he never, not once ever, made an ideological promise. He neither resorted to the language of liberalism, nor that of socialism, which in any event he despised, nor any other ism. What he evoked instead was the joyous serenity of a benignant world framed by broad horizons, dotted with uplands and high roads, and bathed in sunlight. This is a world where the land is bright and a steady light glows. What made Churchill both seer and friend of civilisation was his imagination. The art of rhetoric, the art that Churchill excelled at, is the link between imagination and history. The structure of Churchill's rhetoric emulates and imitates the act of creation. It is a mimesis of creation. His political speeches and historical writings are awash with antonyms, all of them carefully balanced, each faintly, finely, subtly, slyly combined with each other. Here the inherent duality of things, the double, dual, two-by-two quality of existence is not only carefully inscribed, it is also transcribed and interpolated. Each duality is a union, each twin is singular, powerful antonyms belong together just as much as they stand in opposition. Opposites attract, every antithesis is a synthesis. This is as true of history as it is of art. Take, for instance, the British and Allied military victory at El Alamein in October and November 1942 against the German army in North Africa. It was achieved in desperate circumstances. The victory followed upon numerous defeats, a function of the irony of history that most wars, though not won by the meek, are won by the weak. That is, by the weaker or less prepared opponent who, at the outset of war, looks as though they will lose the war. Churchill, like Shakespeare, knew that war, like politics, pivots. When the turning point of history finally came late in 1942, the moment called forth from Churchill the observation that this is not the end, nay, not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. In that line, Churchill draws a distinction between two terms, only then to draw a resemblance between them. Creation is a third imaginary term that binds together two contrary terms. The third term is provided by the media of creation. These media range from pairings and paradoxes through alliteration, rhymes and echoing repetitions. All achieve the impossible. Each in its own way forges a union of the different and the same, perfectly exemplified in a phrase like the end of the beginning. Rather than sharpen the distinction between end and beginning, the act of imagination coalesces them. A grand alliance of terms is created such that the antonym becomes a synonym. What emerges from this is a superpositional entity, the end of the beginning, rather than two distinct counterpositional endings, a beginning and an end. Uncanny unions of this kind reverberate through Churchill's vast prose works. By dint of their compacting of meanings, such forces endow the human world with significance. In Churchill's imagination, summits were peaks to be climbed and conferences that might encapsulate the destiny of humankind. Like the poets, he made memorable metaphors. In the years 1940 and 1941, he became the great national poet as much as the indispensable war prime minister, a striking and enigmatic elision of roles. He mobilised a metaphor in the defence of the metaphorical being and its vocation for civilisation. Alone among the species, the human being has the capacity to see in a thing what it is not, and conversely, to take one thing for another. One thing exists as if or as in another. The philosopher would say that this evokes the uncanny co-presence of space and time, past and present and future, rest and change. From Heraclitus to Leibniz to Simone Weil, the echo rebounds. The imagination elicits the enigmatic multiplicity and unity. In this elision, difference is both distinguishable and at the same time indistinguishable from sameness. It yields similitude. A strange paradoxical relationality haunts the imagination. Thus, we, the species who brokers metaphors, can thereby imagine that what is potential is in fact actual, and that what is plural is singular. The inference is that relations can exist without parts. We also sense, perhaps uneasily, that in the act of creation we combine the act of copying and the act of originality. There is a kind of yoking in all of this. We recognise in the creative act a hint of violence. Destruction is the strange twin of creation. It is an antithesis that nonetheless bears a certain similarity to its opposite. We know full well that wit is cruel. Often it is devastating. There was no more devastating wit in the 20th century than Winston Churchill. Not least of all, he used his wit to mock Corporal Hitler. He ridiculed the tyrant. He launched upon the Hitler regime not just the most ferocious weapons of industrialised warfare, but also the weapon of laughter. The great English philosopher Thomas Hobbes thought that the function of laughter was to belittle others. True, Churchill occasionally made use of this function, notably against the dictators. But more telling than that, I think, is the compressive force of metaphor. The ability to make space-time and time-space has a violence of its own, a ferocity, an intensity that compounds one thing into another, a little like the end of the universe, in which all that will be left of things will be the singularity into which all that is plural is compressed. Every joke is an anticipation of the end of the universe. Jokes exist because we can see, that is, we can imagine, that things that are most unlike each other, in fact, are remarkably like each other. That is what the imagination does. It permits us to see what is unseen. Almost done. Accordingly, the image of the Iron Curtain, plucked by Churchill from obscurity and made famous by him, takes the strongest material and the most flimsy material, each one of them for the other. It is, in this sense, that history is creation. It moves at times like lightning speed. It does not move just from one thing to another. Rather, the act of moving, which here is the act of creating, is possible because one thing can be conceived as another. In 1946, Churchill could clearly foresee the post-war Cold War coming because he could imagine a paradoxical political condition that had some of the characteristics of the belligerent state that engulfed the whole world in the 1940s, and some of the characteristics of a benignant, sunny peace. When it is said that history is creation or that society is creative, we are deploying a metaphor. What we are doing is deploying a metaphor to describe the metaphorical process of human history and the metaphorical state of being of society. We deploy metaphors not only singularly, as the poet does, but socially as well. Conversely, when the poet-statesman coins a metaphor that bears the impress of the imagination, it becomes, by virtue of its compelling power, the lingua franca of society. It becomes the collective self-representation of society, the singular identity of the otherwise fractious, idiosyncratic, teeming and tumultuous members of the social world. Churchill's imagination was a talisman of the imagination in general. It was uncanny. From its uncanny structure, it drew its literary power. I do not mean that it was literary in the sense that a novel is literary or that literary criticism is literary, though Churchill did write one mediocre novel and the occasional perceptive literary profile. Rather, and much more importantly, Churchill deployed with penetrating power the resources of a language that had developed from Tyndale and Donne through Johnson, Austen and Dickens to Shaw. We're inclined to forget that Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. That was not just a political gesture. There's no greater orator in history than Winston Churchill. He is greater than Cicero, whose words were the foundation of European education till the end of the 18th century. In 1,000 years, Churchill will still be read, while Stalin will be remembered like the Greek tyrants of antiquity are today, as one of a bunch of very bad guys whom no one really cares to distinguish between. Most mid-20th century intellectuals preferred Stalin to Churchill. Even now, astonishingly, a few still do. But time is an unhearing judge in these matters. So, while Stalin had many thoughts that would thick the blood, would anyone today wish to read his collected works? I don't think so. Thank you.
Support for one of your many theses in someone who should have been mentioned already today, Dostoevsky, in The Possessed, the violent political actor Peter Berkovensky, who's a psychopath, basically has no attachment to anybody. And Dostoevsky's reading, which I think comes through in a lot of literature subsequently, is that if you have no attachments to anything or anyone, your only pleasure is power. And if your only pleasure, actually he enjoys eating, he's got two pleasures, eating and power. If your only pleasure is power, that really means pleasure in destruction. But he has no imagination whatsoever.
Exactly. Yeah. No.
And he admits that. On Churchill, and the imagination, equally important. It's impossible to say these sort of things, but to me, what's very important with reading Churchill is tradition, certain British tradition, which includes the language of Tyndale, especially Shakespeare's Henry V, and Edmund Burke, and includes the military exemplars like the Duke of Wellington. And so there's sort of, on the one hand, you could stress imagination, but on the other hand, there's very much a sort of almost conservative tradition, both in literature and in military example. There's also, they read Homer generation after generation after generation, and the Latin poets.
Well, let me say, I agree completely. But I don't draw a distinction between the imagination and the conservative. In fact, I was going to preface this paper by saying to Andrew Benjamin often asks me the question, why do I often describe myself as a conservative? And I was going to preface the paper by saying that this paper in part is an answer to that question.
But I think it still leaves the question. I think that this is a very good point. And if you go back and if you look at Hume's exchange with Bolingbroke over whether or not the beheading of Charles was correct or not, part of the argument adduced is that it almost for Burkean reasons, it interrupted a notion of chronological time that was interarticulated with tradition, and you could not have that. That was an impossible state of affairs, etc., etc., etc. The difficulty is that once you want to argue that the imagination is the same, not the same as, but is compatible with an argument for tradition, then you have genuine problems. Because what Shakespeare does in Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, is show us that actually there is no... The one who holds political power is the one who holds political power. And the political power can be wrested from any notion of divine right or anything like this. So if one understands tradition as that which must unfold inexorably in its own terms, such a question of legitimacy has been undone all the way through. There's never been any notion of... So therefore it becomes unclear what the claim is about tradition, except some sort of phantasmatic claim about chronological time or the temporality of tradition, or basically historicism. And it seems to me then the problem would be, what is the relationship between the imagination, in the way you and I are both using the term, and historicism? And that's why the Benjamin quote, I think, does, with the greatest respect, damage to your argument. Because historicism presupposes the inexorability of time understood as the laws of nature. Nothing can buck the laws of nature. And precisely when Benjamin says, yes, but what stands opposed to that is the unexpected interruption. And I then said, well, that's precisely what one understands the work of the imagination to do, and that's why the imagination calls for judgment. But that's what the imagination does. Therefore, if you want to run a connection between the imagination and tradition, you'd have to say that the ground of judgment for acts of the imagination is a notion of tradition. Not that there's a compatibility between the two. But once you show that notion of tradition as sort of a phantasmatic invention, the way historicism is, in the Benjaminian sense of historicism, is the naturalisation of chronological time, then it's just inherently antithetical to the notion of the imagination. That's why I always ask you why you're a conservative, because it seems to me incompatible to hold to the imagination as productive and generates that which is, as it were, yet to be envisaged, whilst holding to a notion of tradition in which there is located the always already envisaged.
But Burke doesn't. Burke's not saying all tradition is good. Burke's argument basically is the English people happen to have very good instincts and very good prejudices, and in this country, our institutions and our traditions are a much more reliable guide to maintaining the nation and everything else. Yeah. But obviously, there are all sorts of bad traditions.
No, but I'm not arguing Burkean. I'm just simply saying that when you want to make a claim, and I wasn't arguing about Burke, I was saying in general, the evocation of a notion of tradition.
Yeah, but there's you could say there's two ways to look at tradition. And one is that tradition is historicist, but the other is tradition is always open to new inquiry and interpretation. If you look, for example, at the unfolding of Talmudic inquiry with the great rabbis, and they're all looking at tradition, and yet it's still unfolding anew and differently over...
Sorry.
Over...
What's happened?
Millennia. But the other thing about historicism, and what's wrong with historicism, is that in fact, if you want to talk about natural law, in physics, you have to talk about something that's deductive, a set of common laws that hold across all space and time. But when you talk about anything in the biological realm, in fact, you're always having random mutation, contingency, and chance, even unfolding within natural law. And that's why today we have one set of animals on the earth and not the whole set of 2,000 others that have come and gone in between.
Let me pick up the thread of this. Before I take another question, I also want to have a response to Andrew's question. Because I think that there is you overinvest in the word tradition, and the conservative is not simply just an equation with tradition. And I mean the classic conservative figure, the one that everybody cites, Burke, right, was a Whig, not a Tory, but became by a century later the conservative figure precisely because Burke, in very interesting and very sophisticated ways, actually in his writings, thought and practice, was able to meld together what, yes, we would commonly understand as tradition, that is the pre-existing ballast of a society, together with Whiggish views of a society which is orientated to the future. So the gift of the conservative is actually to be able to, and which is also the gift of the imagination, which is able to make past and future co-present together, so that they are in fact not at war with each other and do not seek to destroy each other, and in fact are mutually embellished by each other.
Which is exactly Churchill.
Which is Churchill, and which I think, is also, I think, the proper relationship, in fact, that we have with things like the arts, for example, that I think great artists draw upon the traditions in which they're embedded in a larger sense, and at the same time are capable in that relationship to create the future in the sense of what is new. But art that is simply dominated by the new, for example, is, as I think we all understand, is frequently and usually fatuous in nature. And so on. So that's my basic response to that.
I really enjoyed this paper much more than the other one on humour. But I understand the connection between the two. And both agree and also disagree with it for a number of different kind of reasons, but they're kind of because I think Churchill is a stand-in category or a stand-in figure for you for something else, and it's to do with the label of conservative. To pick up Andrew and also John's point, because it's occurring to me why you're making the moves that you're making. And it's to do with, in a sense, each of our relationships, curiously, I think, to Kant, and not only to Castoriadis. Now, within the Kantian scheme, the relationship between, the problem of judgment is a problem of reason, as well as the relationship between reason and imagination. Now, it struck me like a thunderbolt that the question that you're asking, or at least the problem that you're asking yourself, is not to do with conservatism and tradition, but actually the relation. No, what is good judgment? And good judgment is not a relationship to reasoning, but good judgment is a relationship to the faculty of the imagination in the way in which you actually portray it. Hence, in a sense, the last number 33 is perfect in terms of this, because Peter's perpetual peace is not to the end of the wars of metaphors, but actually the relationship between judgment and the faculty of the imagination in order to generate what good judgment might be. Hence your attraction to the figure of Churchill in terms of making good judgment at world historical moments about the nature of both the past and the future of something called world civilization. We can debate. I
do agree. I mean, Churchill had astonishingly good judgment. Even though Stanley Baldwin, who gave a great off-the-cuff recitation about Churchill in the 1930s, stunning. He listed a whole list of Churchill's virtues, abilities, talents, like this, off the top of his head. I mean, Baldwin knew Churchill intimately, understood the great gifts that he had. And then right at the end of the long paragraph, he says he's got everything but judgment. And that actually proved to be incorrect. And the reason why Churchill had the judgment that he had, even though often at the time it was not realised that he had the judgment that he had, because he was making judgments about what was to come. But he was, more often than not, proved to be true, even under the most controversial of circumstances. It is precisely because of, yes, you are correct, a relationship to the imagination. And that judgment needs a relationship to the imagination. I'll just make two very quick additional comments before you jump in. The thing is, people who lack judgment, one also conventionally in everyday terms calls them stupid, right? They abound. There are a lot of them. People who lack judgment, even people in high offices and sophisticated places, in marvellous elite universities are actually idiots.
This is not a cognitive.
It's not about intelligence.
Exactly.
It's about imagination. And the other thing is that will not provide you with good judgment, whether it be political judgment or judgment in your family life or anything like that, is reason. If reason is also disconnected with the faculty of imagination, which is at one point is the faculty of sympathy, in basic human terms, right? If you wish not to be a cruel person, you have to be at some measure of sympathy. If you don't have sympathy, you easily fall into the habit of cruelty.
Yeah,
it's a casual attitude.
Yeah.
Ira.
Oh, sorry.
Ira.
I was
no, Ira.
but
Ira.
No.
No, it's not central to your argument. I don't think it's shifted. But just marginal point about Churchill being prophetic or imaginative about the partition of India, and
sure.
that the seeds of that were sown at the very least 50 years ago. So it wouldn't have needed a lot of judgment or a lot of insight to be able to predict that was going to happen. So, I mean, I think there'd probably be better examples of his judgment and foresight than this one, because there were a lot of people who were making that point. And it was really, I mean, the way the partition happened, you know, how quickly it was. I mean, it was really, it was writing on the wall, you know, that this is what's going to happen.
My only footnote to that is to say that was not true actually in British politics. It may or may not have been true in Indian politics, but from my reading of Indian politics also, there was a lot of, how would you call it, fanciful overestimation about what would happen at partition. I mean, there's very few of the major nationalist politicians in India who, made frank statements about what was liable to happen. Apart from anything else, it's a political liability to make such frank statements. And frankly, most people in British politics, including those who ran the empire, were essentially clueless about what was going to unfold, and that they wished to jettison India for quite practical reasons, that they were fed up with the nationalists giving them a hard time and that the empire was a costly business. There's all sorts of practical reasons why they wanted to jettison it.
They would also not want to acknowledge it because a lot of the responsibility for this violence, it was actually the seeds were sown by the British. Their policies in India were really fomented that kind of trouble. So that would also probably be one reason why there was a silence about that in British politics, because to be able to predict that would also be maybe taking on some measure of responsibility.
It is possible, and part of good judgment is being, in fact, imaginatively frank about one's own bad policies to the extent that they exist as well. So I don't have. There's no need to walk away from that. I mean, there are many. In all of these great historical events, there are many actors who have a hand in shaping events.
The critical thing in this discussion, I don't want this to go away before we finish, is this business between judgment and tradition.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it seems to me that a vital thing here is vocation. Churchill's vocation is politics, and the critical tradition for him then is the political tradition. If I think of the two painters whose work I admire most, Raphael and Poussin, they're conservative in terms of the tradition of the forefathers that they respect, and they're trying to rethink categories, and they're not just painters, forefathers. But they're both deeply subversive of the Catholic Church. They're not at all conservative in terms of, one of their major patrons. On the contrary.
Churchill was deeply subversive, just as an analogy here, of all the British political parties. He freely moved between parties. His great idea, which was finally realised during the war, was a national coalition. And in fact, I think I've said to you this in conversation, that while Churchill became British Prime Minister in whatever it was, in May 1940, whatever the date was, it took almost a year for him to become leader of the Conservative Party, the Tory Party. And that was because he was deeply distrusted by many or most of the major figures in British politics. But this also went to the question of his imagination, because in Kantian senses, Churchill had an enlarged mind. And I think one of the nice sort of riffs that Arendt plays upon Kant, and in particular in her failed work on the imagination, her latent failed work on the imagination, is to riff on the Kantian idea of the enlarged mind. But I think my reservations about the Kantian enlarged mind is it can simply become a bucket into which one throws everything. And I think one of the things it is clear to me that both the imagination, both in the general terms or as a particular example, whether it's Poussin or whether it's Churchill, whatever it is actually a highly structured and well-ordered thing. It's not simply a bucket into which one throws everything. It's like the problem that modern universities have with creating curricula, right? When they set out to create curricula, what they take is just everything and they chuck it in. I have to say that ain't imagination.
But also the imagination, when you use the term, and I can see now why that what I was arguing could lead in the same way, and I'm now curious about this, is it's almost, and I loathe the word post, but I will use it, a post-political term. And if you understand the political in a straightforward Marxist sense, or a straightforward democratic sense, which is the same, namely a genuine choice between two alternative visions.
Sure.
So whether those visions represent class interests or whatever, so we tend to live post-politically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the way in which you're using the concept of imagination makes it a post-political term, in that there is, as it were, just so. The interesting thing about Churchill for you is that, given the comment you just made, is that he's almost supra-political, in the sense that the imagination should attract everyone, as it were. It's not linked to a particular project, one
Correct.
versus the other. And it's that I have a genuine reservation about whether or not we're, as it were, ready for the post-political, or to make it in a less fatuous way, whether or not you can be imaginative, or the imagination works as much within a Tory mentality as it would within a social democratic mentality, or whether or not, no, seriously, whether or not there can be conflicting visions, both of which are works of the imagination. And the way you're using the term would seem to preclude that as a possibility. And if that's true, then the imagination becomes the concept for a post-political thinking of the political.
I used to think that. I mean, as I've been working out these concepts, one of my own personal reservations about it was that sort of notion. I mean, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I might have sat in this room and said that to myself. I mean, I think what I've said in this paper, I've made a couple of points that are fairly careful points, which don't quite align with that. I understand the point. I mean, I understand how it can be read. I'm not surprised by that reading. What I see is rather than post-political, in some sense post-ideological, that I would be much more comfortable with.
That's all I mean. That's all I mean.
Because I think if you look at the most interesting things that came out politically of the 20th century, it was actually the ability to interweave certain ideas, the actual traditions of the isms, be it liberalism or socialism or so on, leave a lot to be desired, both in terms of their legacy at the time and their legacy, subsequently.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't want this to be mistaken. I hope it's not been mistaken as an exercise in any sense of, open up a pot and throw everything in, of relativism, of non-judgmentalism, or anything of that kind. I mean, somebody, and this is why I use it. One of the reasons I use the example of Churchill. Nobody in the 20th century had a greater positive impact upon the 20th century than Winston Churchill did.
But actually,
he had to make decisions and judgments constantly. He spent a life doing that.
Conceptual arguments and historical arguments. And I, again, not being a historian, I really worry about looking for the proof for a conceptual claim in a historical, like, I have a conceptual argument here, my proof is what Churchill did.
Sure.
And I guess I'm no more than uneasy about, partly because I think that there are, as it were, not historical, but certainly counter-historical documents. When, Malevich talks, which we saw earlier, when Malevich talks about his own work, and says that what makes his work possible, I quote him now, is that we should not be the peddlers of antiques.
Sure.
In other words, he operates with that modernist notion that one advances what one has through an act of creative destruction, that the imagination depends upon an act of creative destruction in order not to peddle antiques. Now, I have no view in this instance whether that's right or wrong. Okay, I just note it as a possible way in which one can talk about the imagination as premised upon where an opening is dependent upon a notion of an ending. I mean, one of the interesting you came up with anyone you want to discuss. I mean, Hölderlin says, the gods have fled. It's the fact that gods have fled enables us to do what we've done. In other words, that an opening depends upon a closing. Now, it's unclear. Now, that to my mind is a perfect way of talking about the imagination as creative, etc., etc., etc. But I think it's in contradistinction to the way in which you're wanting to argue the relationship between the imagination and tradition. Now, that's merely to say that there are conflicting understandings of the notion of a creative imagination. And given that, the philosophical or the theoretical task, whatever word you want, is to understand that where we are is always caught between conflicting understandings of the imagination, both of which are creative, both of which are imaginative by definition, and yet there is a theoretical or philosophical incompatibility between, Murphy's use of the imagination and Churchill, and Malevich's use of the imagination and the refusal to be peddlers of antiques. And the democratic in me says, what we have to do is live with both. That's why it can't be post-political or post-ideological, because here we have two different ideological versions or visions of the creative imagination. And what worries me is that your position in being post-ideological refuses, but not you personally, but your position almost refuses by definition to concede the very possibility of an antithetical, non-violent conception of the imagination that is not equated, it can't be equated to your own.
Yes, how was I saying?
Sorry, that's probably too much.
Yeah. No, it's not. And I do want to actually respond to this. Is that because it is in the nature of intellectual life, there will be different constructions or images, competing images of what the imagination is. So that's, I think, part of what we deal with, because that's our job. In a sense, poor sods that we are. And I think, though, beyond that, a little bit in a sort of sense of you can say it in a Hegelian sense, or in a sense of the irony of things, or however one wants to label it. I think part of when one is met with a challenge of, well, this is a countervailing notion of the imagination, then one of the interesting intellectual exercises is precisely to take things like maybe the avant-garde knew, and see how one folds that in, perhaps in an ironical sense, into one's larger system. That's a philosophical exercise. Final point I'd make is about philosophical styles, and there also goes to intellectual styles. My philosophical style, or an intellectual style, philosophical style, that I have often recourse to do is to develop philosophical arguments using historical illustrations. Okay, that's a style. That I would acknowledge is not, generally speaking, Andrew Benjamin's style of doing things. Now, is it illicit to use for philosophical purposes, because ultimately this has a underlying philosophical intent, historical illustrations? Well, I'm not going to sit in judgment in that. I'm just going to throw it out into the pool of things.
I think
Andy. Yeah, go on, Andy. Go on.
Sorry, I just
A new voice here.
No, well, just a couple of empirical questions. It just seems there's a couple of things that are missing from this notion of the post-ideological imagination and violence. And the one kind of silence in this is when we're talking about Churchill, we're talking about a man who volunteered to go back to the Western Front in his late 40s, which is like someone in their 60s going to Afghanistan because they kind of want to.
Correct.
So we're actually talking about someone who was tremendously comfortable with violence, and indeed, and I'm also thinking about sort of Niall Ferguson's history of the First World War that talks about the level of excitement that a lot of people experienced in that. And it just seems that seems to be a subtext to what we're talking about.
Okay.
And the second thing is also the question of with the take on India, where that thinking ended up going. And I'm thinking of a trajectory that goes through Enoch Powell's comments against the Holocaust massacre and the way that he actually sort of situated that against within his own stance against multiculturalism, and where that comes out in things like Boris Johnson's novel, I think, sort of, what is it, the 12 Virgins or whatever it is, which is basically a story about, whichever way you look at it, Britain was just better when it was all white, and this man is now the Mayor of London. So, there's kind of, I suppose, there's a question of where these acts of imagination come from, and where they go to in terms of their effects on British history.
Yeah,
Can I just interrupt you? You should finish quickly because we need to call it to an end so other people can leave, then we can continue informally.
Yeah, okay. Can I take this as the final question?
Yes, that's right, Vice.
See, what a good chair. Responsible. Okay.
I think you can tell me.
Now, the first one was Churchill and violence, his personal bed. Churchill was personally extraordinarily brave individual who, and this comes back to John's paper before. Churchill would be a very good example to include in your categories of things. And he during the Blitz and so on, when all of the cabinet and everybody in the government was down in the basement secure and so on, he was up on the parapets, watching the bombers coming. He had no fear of war. I mean, no fear of, but I would say no fear of death, but not a. It wasn't
an unreasonable fear of death.
No, that's right. At the same time, he had, and this is the interesting paradox of Churchill, and this is why one of the reasons why he constantly, 1901 stands up and says there's a catastrophe coming. At various times, he is, as well as foreseeing the catastrophes of war, he's often as much responsible for the shrinking of military spending as he is for the expansion of military spending. I mean, it goes up and down according to the particular phases of his career. He never speaks of war without talking about the evil of war. Never. He understood that the coming of war was catastrophic for human societies. He had some sense of the inevitability of war because of the nature of who we are and these kinds of things, but he never, ever, ever glorifies war. He always speaks of it, and he's a person who wrote 15 million words, each one of them very carefully selected. There was not one word ill-selected. Quite extraordinary, 15 million words, not one ill-selected. This makes Andrew and I being up at 2 o'clock in the morning look pathetic by comparison. He was very careful about never ever to glorify war, and most of his speeches about war is warning of the coming of war, and this is a pestilence and a bad thing and something to be avoided, and there are ways of avoiding it which usually don't come to fruition, and so on and so forth. What was the second question? The second question was about...
Well, there's the question of where his ideas went in terms of how they were picked up in the post-war period.
Sure.
I think there was a certain line of very skillful, what you call conservative thinking, that nevertheless ends up in some pretty bad places in contemporary British politics. That aren't post-ideological at all.
That's maybe true. That really is a discussion for a much longer discussion. I'd just say in terms of the coming of what later became known as multiculturalism, but the multicultural British society, the polyglot British society, Churchill in the early 1950s, as he's both out of office and comes back into office, he's basically accepting of its reality. He has certain Edwardian underlying slight discomfort, prejudices about it, but never stands in the way of the development of it as a policy. In the same way as when he loses the battle over the future of India, he says, fine, you guys won, I'm not going to mention the subject again.
Okay.
So, okay?
And at that point, we can continue after, but
sure.
I just want to, on behalf of all of us, I'm sure, thank Peter for bringing us all together for an absolutely inspiring day, and thank you very much.